couple points. First, why do you have organizations set up as pyramids? Because that setup works extremely well if what you're trying to do is to optimize what you're currently doing, to do it more effectively, do it more efficiently, do it at bigger scale. And for decades, that worked. That helped to scale businesses, make them more profitable, make them more productive. The challenge that you have now is the nature of the game is changing because you've got competitive life cycles decreasing. You've got a company dropping out of the S&P 500 index every 2 weeks. Facebook isn't even 10 years old. It's a $100 billion company. So an organizational design that worked in one era really hampers things in another, first point. Second point, if you think this is better in some of the other countries in Asia, like China, you're crazy. It's much worse in most of those countries. The hierarchy that you feel in those companies, the bureaucracy you feel, the degree to which whoever has the most gray hair not only has the right answer, they get genuflected to in meetings. This is not better in other parts of at least this region. In pockets, of course, in every country, you're going to find a company like this. But this is a big problem just about everywhere. And I think the third point that I would say, this gets to the question of, in different cultures, why do you see different risk aversions? I think one place you ought to look at really carefully is what happens to someone when they go bust or go bankrupt. If you look in the United States, you go bankrupt, not a big deal. Your balance sheet's wiped clean, whether it's a company or individual, you go back and you do it again. In other countries, you still have legacies of debtor's prison, where if you go bankrupt, not only does it affect you, it affects your kids and your kids' kids and so on. And there are justifiable reasons why people don't take risks. All these things can be explained if you understand how systems work.
Who's next? You're all too frightened. It's true, isn't it? Impossible dream. Pyramids. Yes.
If I may have a second one then. So what's the role of the United Nations in fixing up all these problems in the world? Surely that's the answer. Surely they're the ones. Come on. And if not the United Nations, what other organisation is going to help us at the global level?
I'm not going to comment on the United Nations. I'll leave that to people who work with the United Nations down on the other side of the table. They can talk about it. But I will say my own view for who is best positioned to affect some of the very big and very real changes or challenges that we face. And they're real. We got to feed 9 billion people. We got to bring healthcare to hundreds of millions more. People still don't have electricity. They don't have clean water and so on. I have a personal belief, and I'll talk more about this tomorrow, that of course entrepreneurs have a big role in doing this. If you think that there isn't entrepreneurialism going on in this country or in the United States, again, you're kidding yourself. Go spend a week in Silicon Valley, go see what's happening in different startup companies. We saw a young man today who's working on an awesome idea. There are more out there than there ever have been before. So I think entrepreneurialism is very alive and well. At the same time, something that I think is almost a paradox is in an era where it has never been easier to start a company. You can, except if you're in the Ukraine, you can start a company like this. You can get revenues like this. You can begin cranking like this. It is the best time in the world to be inside a large company. And there are a few, still a precious few, that are having massive impact along some of the problems we've talked about tonight. If you want to hear more about that, you have to come back tomorrow at 12:20.
Bjorn, did you want to say something?
Well, I think the UN in many ways reflect both all of our aspirations. It really is, the idea and the dream of the world coming together, and it's also very often the butt of the joke of this incredible inefficiency. And I think we need to recognize the UN for what it is, and it's the UN organizations. It's a way to make sure that we have our aspirations. We were just talking at the table about the Millennium Development Goals and the next set of goals that we're going to set out for the world. And I think that's a great idea in principle to talk about how do we solve the big issues, what kinds of goals do we set ourselves. We want a world with half the poverty. We want a world where everybody goes to school. We want a world where moms don't die kind of thing. That's a good idea. Let's do that. I think there's a large gap from those sorts of statements to what we actually need to achieve. And unfortunately, quite a bit of that is, yes, I totally agree, a lot of the world is going to be made better by individual innovators. But we also need to recognize that there's a huge gap of things that don't have any particular, certainly profitable need right now. Take, for instance, one of the things I think we often forget. Do you remember back in the around 1970, our biggest fear was that we were going to run out of food in some sense. We were, India was a basket case. We'd never solve all these problems we had. And one of the people and one of the organizations that solved that was Norman Borlaug, who essentially developed high-yielding agriculture, the Green Revolution, the idea of being able to produce a lot more food on the same amount of land. That saved India, that saved a lot of other people. And we've gone complacent. It's one of the best ways to actually help humanity to get the yield increases up. It's one of the ways that we can make sure that people get cheaper food so they can do other things. It's one of the ways that we can safeguard both biodiversity and keep people from chopping down rainforest, which also commits to global warming. So there are lots of ways we can do that, but we need government funding for that. So I would also argue there are places where we definitely need government money. Obviously, global warming is another way. So we need to sort of realize the UN as the goal-setting thing. I think the main engine is going to be from individual innovators, but we also need to have those common problems solved by common denominators in some sense of democracies, I'd argue.
So if you're getting it from the government, would it help to have a science minister, or don't you need a science minister?
Oh, I feel there's a trick question underneath that.
Say yes, Bjorn, say yes.
Jason?
I agree with you on that, that we do need transnational leadership, but we need appropriate leadership. We should, I think, close the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the Global Bank for Settlements. We should close all of those and reinvent them, because those were necessary to overcome our problems post the wars. What should a modern structures, global structures, look like? That should be funded by governments and companies. We should have a global institute to look after our seas. We should have a global institute for peace. We should have a global institute for the poor. And not confuse them with things like the Security Council, which is so Western and old-fashioned and based, not inclusive and Asian and focused on peace. So we should reinvent all of these systems. How you can have a World Health Organization that isn't the same thing as food and agriculture, because food and agriculture and health are the same thing. We need to redefine these institutions for the 21st century. And just having had COP 18 or 19, I don't know what it is, I've given up 20 goes at trying to reform and structure our things. You cannot let these institutions reform. You have to close them and start again.
John, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I worked with UNICEF for many years, and I worked with UNHCR for quite a number of years as well. And I have to say they're very impressive organizations. What's killed them is the fact that they have to be accountable to governments who have different agendas. The people who are on the ground, who are out there around the world right now saving lives, who are out there in the Philippines, they're fantastic, fantastic people. And when they're given the right tools, they go to the ends of the earth to make the world a better place. Where it gets sticky is where you start going 4 or 5 levels up in the hierarchy. And when you start to go 7 or 8 or 9 levels up in the hierarchy, then it doesn't get sticky, you're walking in treacle. And I think what I'm hearing here is there is a role for governments and for transnationals cooperation to enable people who want to make a difference to have the tools to go and do it.
Well, let me bring in an idea that Australia could actually run with quite well. At least I thought so 15 years ago when we had a fellow from the ANU who was an expert on geothermal energy. He looked at hot rocks like they have in South Australia. And he told me ways in which they've got at least 19 obstructions which they went through. And one of them that they solved was that there was no law that told you how to get energy out of the ground. You could take minerals out of the ground, there were laws about that. But heat? So, hot rocks still haven't happened in South Australia. There's another one which is being led by the people at the University of Melbourne. Rachel Webster is Professor of Physics there. And their idea is to use the blanket of coal, the brown coal, the wet coal in the Latrobe Valley as a blanket, squirt CO2 down and get the heat back up again, enough to run half of Victoria for the next 200 years. Now, fairly straightforward technologies, one would have thought. We've got mining expertise. Surely the investment should be forthcoming, and yet it hasn't been. Hugh, may I ask you the question as to why hasn't geothermal energy happened in this country to show the world how it's done?
Well, I think Geothermal, there have been some significant geothermal activities in South Australia, parts of New South Wales, where there's a heat gradient that's abnormal at near surface areas. The drilling, my recollection is that the drills required for this, there's only about 2 or 3 of them in the country, if that. The holes that cost maybe $10 to $15 million each. And it's still very much in the experimental issue here. You're right about the laws are not well developed yet for this, and understanding the transmission effects of water that circulates through these series of holes and gets used as hot water or super steamed water is still under development here. I think it's moving forward. The federal government is supporting it, but I'd have to say not as a matter of urgency. There are, of course, hot rock energy electricity produced in places like New Zealand, where most of the hot water is near surface and it's not super hot. It's an emerging and encouraging alternatives to our current electricity production, and it's one of the things to which, very sensibly, government should be encouraging scientific research. It should get full support here as one of the possible alternatives.
Yeah, one can infer as well that it's not urgent because you've got this cheap coal and you don't want to bother. And when I keep doing interviews on national radio with these people saying, it's almost like you're doing medicine, where they say we've got this fantastic cure for whatever it is, and in 5 or 10 years' time, it'll be there. Now, I'm old enough to go back in 5 or 10 years' time to say, well, where is it? And, I sometimes get embarrassed doing science broadcasting because the promise of miracles goes on forever. And the reality, well, okay, you've got some devices in your pockets. There was someone over here. Yes. Yeah, Ross.
So where do the lobbyists fit in all of this? They haven't come up yet. They might be a bit of a problem.
Anyone here a lobbyist?
No,
In
but
any sense or form?
I think lobbyists fit in the corner and the box with a padlock on that's dropped to the bottom of the ocean and left there.
How do you make that happen?
You change the rules around funding of political parties.
Do you know, so many people, including Barack Obama, said that they were going to downplay the role of lobbyists in, say, Washington. More powerful than ever. It doesn't change.
No.
Pardon?
Money talks.
Money talks.
It does. Money talks, and we, as the voters, and I speak as a North American, even though I come from Toronto, we've got some mayoral issues going on at the moment.
He's pretty good, isn't he?
Yeah, he's great. Anybody want him?
Looks handsome too.
I'll put him on a plane personally.
Democracy working again.
Yeah, that's right. The issue is that we do get to vote for these people, and we do get, should we choose, to make an issue about this. Civil society in places like the US is alive and well. Should we choose as people that this is important enough to us, then the policymakers will follow us. And I am heartened to see the MoveOn.orgs and the Change.orgs and the civil society organizations that are getting together and are doing things online and are really gathering millions of people around big issues, because people are starting to find their voice. Now, we're not there yet, but we are beginning to find our voice.
Now, this will be the last part of what we talk about, finding your voice, making a difference. We've heard what the problems are. Some of them we knew about, others you've reinforced. How do we shift to face the future creatively? Those voices, how do you make them heard?
Well, we've lived for a long time in a world of fear and compassion. And on the one side, we've had fear, and on the other side, we've had compassion, which has been typified by the world that I've worked in for 20 years, which is the not-for-profit world, which is, here's a cute puppy, as you said, yeah, or a nice little panda. Beautiful, here's $10, now please bugger off. That's the world of compassion. Somewhere in between all this is the world of empathy. And the world of empathy is actually being able to understand the other person, wanting to understand the other, and having the tools to understand the other. Now, the tools that we've got today, very different from the ones we had 5 years ago. Our ability to look at problems differently today, very different from where we were 5 years ago. The ability of a conversation to spread globally in the time it would take us to have a conversation in this room, very different to 5 years ago. So we're beginning to realize that the tools are there. We're beginning to find our voice. The trick is, as it always is that a small group of people are going to help a big group of people see the world in a slightly different way. And that's going to be people who look at problems differently and who create empathy from people on one side and people on the other side, and make us realize that actually we can work together.
May I recommend a book that does precisely that was published about 3 months ago? It's by Jonathan Porritt. It's called The World We Made, and it's a number of letters written by somebody called Alex. Alex could be male or female. He didn't give you any clues as to which on purpose. And he looks at everything, the food, the planes, the organizations, the climate, how we actually did it in 2050, having imagined what kind of world we would like. And there is a book which, in wonderfully illustrated fashion, it's very easy to read, brilliant ideas. You know Jonathan Porritt, some of you do. He's highly experienced and absolutely You've got the book. Ha-ha, well done. There it is. I'm not an agent for him, but I think he's a most wonderful writer, and he's been in the field for a long time. So that's one way forward to loosen up and imagine what could be done. Bjorn, your view on how we get there and how we make a difference. Take-home messages.
I think one of the big problems is that we will still not get rid of the panda. We'll just be talking about different pandas. I would worry. And to a certain extent, I think what we have to recognize is we would so much love that this world was entirely different. We have this idea of we're in a cusp, we're at a turning point. Our lives are uniquely interesting, and I would argue, no, we're a link in a very long evolution of fixing a lot of problems. And many of the problems are very much the same as they were 5 or 10 years ago, and they will be the next 5 or 10 years.
Is that really true? Let me give you an example. I mentioned, we're coming up for the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War, industrialized war. And yet, Steven Pinker from Harvard says this is the most peaceful period in the history of humanity. You wouldn't have thought so, would you?
Yes.
Something happened.
No, and that's and Steve uses 700 pages trying to explain. I'm not sure he really knows how to. I think if you actually look at the vast majority of this, it was the monopolization of violence from the state, which is a totally different issue, and one that we fixed a couple of 100 years ago at least. But again, yes, there's definitely progress. But I think we often fail to remember what are the really important things. There's still about 1 billion people starving. There is about 1.2 billion without electricity. There is 2.5 billion without clean drinking water and sanitation.
You're sounding like Paul Ehrlich.
Sorry?
I said you're sounding like...
No, the point is these numbers are going down slowly, and certainly the proportion of people are going down slowly. So we are fixing more problems than we are creating. But we tend to focus very much on the next sexy thing instead of realizing a lot of the things are the same things we need to tackle. This is not to, of course, global warming is a new problem, AIDS is a new problem. There's lots of different things that have come around, and we've fixed some of the big problems. We've hopefully found a way to avoid war, although I would still say there's a couple of nuclear weapons out there we haven't accounted for, and all that. But fundamentally, we need to get back to reality and talk about not what's the cute pandas, but what would actually make a big difference. And that requires us to, if you will, cut through the BS and talk about what are the big issues in the world.
I think that, I'm 120% on board with you until...
This is where the statistician works.
That's right. Until you bring in the fact that the people who are holding this back are I mean, call them the fearmongers or call them whatever you else, but the people who are using fear, the people who are using extremism, the people who, I mean, the Tea Party, for God's sake, who are using all sorts of passionate and impassioned arguments. And when you put facts and science and gradualism up against that, it just doesn't cut it. So I think that there's something in between, kind of, it's about here, between this idea of you've actually got the truth and the gradualism, and you know where the money should be spent that's going to make a difference. And what I'm trying to focus on is how do you build empathy and get people inspired about the right things? And I think you're right. A lot of the things that we're inspired about and we find sexy today are the wrong things. So how do we move that level of energy and empathy onto the things that are actually going to make a difference? Because if we say, oh, we don't need the sexy stuff, then the people who are going to take the sexy stuff are going to keep doing what they're doing at the moment, and they're going to keep ratcheting up the volume in a way that will just drown out all of the truth that's coming from the kind of work that you're doing.
I think that we need to stop looking for leaders and start leading ourselves. We all know what's right and wrong, and we just need to get on and start doing it. It doesn't matter that what we do we don't think will fix the whole world. If everybody on this planet just did a few more good things and a few less bad things, boy, we'd fix this place very quickly indeed. And that's all we need to do. It's just very simple. We just need to do it ourselves.
And I think the thing that Jason said that you want to emphasize is do. I think talking is great, debating is great, pontificating is great, discussing is great. But the thing that just sticks in my mind is the greatest gift I ever got from one of the project teams that I oversaw. It's a little bobblehead that sits on my desk at home. It's got my head on the body of Yoda. It's known affectionately as Skoda if you're in Poland. That translates in ways that you don't want to use it, but anyway. And on the bottom of that, it says that one of the great lines from Yoda, do or do not. There is no try. And you think about innovation, what is it that stops us from successfully innovating? It's because we forget that. We get in conference rooms and we create these pieces of Microsoft fiction. No disrespect to Microsoft, but we've got these really elegant spreadsheets and these beautiful PowerPoint documents and these great Microsoft Word pros. But that doesn't mean anything until you actually go and do something, until you go and try, until you remember what Thomas Edison said, 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration, you can't have any impact. So I agree,
absolutely
everyone can
agree.
do things, but you gotta do, you can't just talk.
No, I absolutely 120% agree.
Yeah.
Let's take it at 130.
Come on, let's up it.
You know, in China, we're probably one of the least efficient countries. It's very annoying for somebody who has a little bit of OCD. And we're all about iteration, but we have to start from somewhere, and we have to start trying, we have to start implementing, we have to start piloting, because we're building a whole ecosystem of people who are doers, people who are skilled laborers, people who hopefully can innovate the next generation of hopefully more efficient technologies and efficient practices. And we're, 150% agree. Everybody in this room. Sorry, I'm going to beat you there.
Hyperinflation is
yes,
back.
it's like everybody, I'm so sick. I think that's one of the things that drives me crazy about these transnational, I guess, organizations, is that there's or climate talks, is that so much talking and so little doing. And that's why I think the Clinton Global Initiative, which I was lucky enough to be an advisor one year to, I think that's one thing that really attracts me to that model. Again, no model is perfect, but it's all about doing. It's a do tank.
Well, if I can make a tiny contribution, I'm in a broadcasting organisation. Don't tell anyone I said this, by the way, outside this room, otherwise. And we're absolutely obsessed by platforms and tweeting and devices and all sorts of things like that. And sometimes I have to walk across the foyer talking to a banana to make them think that I've actually got a device. And when they ask me how I would face the future with some sort of optimism and flair and change, I said something very, very simple and terribly old-fashioned. I said, hire kids. Kids are cheap. They don't have PAs. Sometimes they don't even have a sodding desk. And they come and they change the atmosphere completely. You use their brilliant young brains and you set them loose. As evidence for that, every week in my programs, I broadcast 4 or 5 minutes of a PhD, and they're all talking about innovation, and they're all incredibly optimistic and they've got some fantastic ideas for the future, and they're all going to be unemployed. I met 2 or 3 of them about, 4 weeks ago, and they're all waiting to be signed up by the CSRO and a couple of other organisations. They were the first ones to get the chop last week. Hire the kids. So simple. Give them a job. Not for life, like I've had so far. You want to say something?
Quick comment on that. Why do you have to hire them? Why can't you empower them to make their own companies?
In broadcasting, how many people do science broadcasting outside the ABC? The PhDs, okay, the PhDs, well, they might well be hired by companies. It doesn't happen very much in this country. Corporations do not, except with Western Mining and a couple of other firms like that. The PhD I admire at the moment is called Andrew. He's the new managing director of BHP. He's got a PhD in geology. But the range of jobs available, if you just look at the figures, is quite disappointing. Last words from anybody? Tanya? 30 seconds each, starting with Bjorn, on call to action.
We need to get more rational, and we do that by looking at what's the size of the problem, what are the solutions that we can come up with, talk about the cost and benefits, and honestly, don't look at the cute pandas, but look at what actually gives the biggest bang for the buck.
The future is going
And
to be
agree with everyone 120%.
at least 120%, maybe even 150%. The future is going to be changed by us, and it's going to be changed by you. And it's going to be changed by the people that you talk to. So, this evening, go and do one thing before you go to bed. One thing, one small thing to create a bit of a better future, the future that you want. And realize that as you move forward to creating the future that you want to see, the people that you need to be most wary of are those who use irrational, fear-based arguments to counter the good things that you're bringing to the table, and realize that you will not beat them with science and facts. You will beat them with empathy, and you'll beat them with passion.
I agree with Bjorn that we are not allocating our financial resources in the most efficient way possible, that we should be really focusing on the bigger, hairier problems. I think the problem with that is that our big, hairy problems are nexus issues. For example, the resource-constrained society, nutrition, and these are going to require different cultures coming together, different disciplines coming together to work out what are the incentives of each stakeholder to come together. And even more importantly, we need to bring in other disciplines to solve these problems, because that's where the innovative solutions come from. So I think the call to action is really to understand how we can build empathy by looking through multiple cultural lenses to really understand where different cultures, whether it's Chinese and Australian or solar versus nuclear versus coal, these are all different cultures, the stakeholders that need to come together to create innovative solutions for nexus issues. So I think my call to action is to build empathy with aliens, build cultural, to understand cultural lenses, be a cultural bridge.
200% agree with that.
You beat me.
The way I define innovation is quite simple. It's 5 words: something different that has impact. The most important word by far is the first word, something. Any of you who have children will empathize with the short story I'm about to tell. A couple years ago, our now 8-year-old son Charlie decides he wants to learn how to ride a bike. How do you teach a kid or help him learn how to ride a bike? Do you create a PowerPoint presentation? Do you watch YouTube videos? Do you discuss the theory of bike riding? Do you have committee meetings about it? Do you do financial projections? No. You get on the bike, he gets on the bike, he begins to pedal, he falls down, he gets up, and he begins to learn. So, get on your bike.
Jason. get on your worm.
I'd start dreaming a bit, then decide what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, most importantly, why you're going to do it, and then get a tandem and get on your bike.
The great word apart from something is actually a key word that was in the series I broadcast earlier this year, starting on Australia Day. Mark Dodson, who's Professor of Innovation at the University of Queensland in the Business School, did a fantastic history of innovation in Australia. And he said the key word is collaboration. And if you remember that Financial Review article, the one thing that was missing was effective collaboration between people who don't normally work together. Do that. Tanya.
Yeah, Rob. Thank you so much. Mwah. How about a big round of applause for our wonderful moderator? Robyn Williams. And a superb panel. Bjorn Lomborg, John Duschinsky, Peggy Lou, Scott Anthony and Jason Drew. We thank you so much for your wisdom, your insight and your call to action.